So, usually when you sit down in a doctor's office for a medical diagnosis, there is a very clear expectation of precision.
Right, you want a straight answer.
Yeah, you expect it to be like engineering. I mean, let's say you fall off a ladder and your arm hurts.
Okay.
You go in, they put you under the x-ray machine, the machine hums, and the doctor pulls up that black and white film,
Mm-hmm.
and they point to a jagged white line on the screen and say, there it is. That is the fracture.
It is totally binary,
Yes.
broken or not broken.
Yes, precisely.
You see the line or you do not see the line. The physical world gives us these very clean categories.
It is comforting.
Oh, absolutely. It is incredibly comforting to the human mind. We like things to be visible. We like things to be categorized so we know what we are dealing with.
But then you step into the world of linguistics.
Right.
Specifically, ancient biblical linguistics, and suddenly that x-ray machine just stops working.
The picture gets blurry.
Yeah, the crisp, clean, black and white image disappears, and you are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Full of shadows.
Full of shadows and overlapping concepts. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. Our mission in this deep dive into the source material is to look at a single, seemingly straightforward Greek word and, well, examine how it shaped the core theology of the Christian faith.
It is a massive topic.
It really is. We're going to look at the Greek word homoiōma,
Right.
which translates roughly to likeness, resemblance, or form. And we will also look at its wider word family, including words like homoios, homoiotes, and eikon.
And what is fascinating here is that we are not debating dry dictionary definitions.
No, not at all.
We are looking at the architectural blueprints of major Christian doctrines.
Which doctrines are we talking about?
We are talking about the sinlessness of Jesus Christ, the nature of original sin, and the actual mechanics of baptism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, all these massive theological structures rest on how ancient writers understood and utilized this specific family of words.
So we need to unpack this, because I want you listening right now to see the stakes.
The stakes are incredibly high.
If you get this word wrong, or, if you misunderstand the nuance the ancient writers intended, the entire theological house collapses.
It really does.
You end up with a savior who cannot save, or a view of humanity that completely misreads our current condition.
Yeah.
So to understand this linguistic puzzle, we have to start at the absolute bottom. We have to look at the anatomy of the word itself.
Right. So we need to begin by analyzing the root word, homoios.
Okay.
It generally means the same kind or like.
Mm-hmm.
But to understand its weight, we have to look at its secular history.
You mean before the New Testament?
Yeah, long before the New Testament writers picked it up and applied it to theology.
Mm-hmm.
You find this word going all the way back to Homer, used in common Greek literature.
Really? Homer?
Yeah, in Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, you see it used to describe things that accrue equally to all people, things that are general to the human condition.
What kind of things would Homer use it for, like practically?
Well, Homer talks about an age which is common to all men, or he writes about a death that approaches all equally.
Oh, that makes sense.
He uses this root word, homoios, to describe that shared, equivalent experience.
Got it.
If two soldiers are on a battlefield, they might be from different cities, they might have different backgrounds, but they share a homoios reality,
Which is what?
the inevitable approach of mortality.
Okay, so it carries this idea of a shared reality, two people facing the same inevitable outcome.
Yes. And as the Greek language developed over centuries, the word found a very specific technical home in ancient Greek geometry.
Geometry.
Yeah, geometry. You see mathematicians like Euclid using it in his definitions for similar figures.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, if you draw a small triangle on a piece of parchment, and then you draw a massive triangle on the ground, but they share the identical angles, Euclid would use this word to describe them.
Because they correspond to each other.
Right. Aristotle uses it when talking about triangles as well, referring to figures that are equal in their proportions.
Interesting.
And Plotinus uses it for numbers, like the square of a number being the product of two equal factors. The word highlights an agreement. It points out the specific way in which one thing is similar or equal to another in its structure or correspondence.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting for me. There is a crucial distinction between two words that often get translated into English as the very same thing.
Yes, the translation issue.
Because in English, we might just use the word likeness or image interchangeably. I mean, we do it all the time.
All the time.
But the ancient Greek had homoiōma, which is our focus today, and they had eikon.
Right.
We see eikon pop up a lot. It is where we get the English word icon. So we need to define the boundary lines between these two concepts.
The distinction between those two words is vital for everything we are going to discuss today.
Hmm.
Icon, or image, presupposes an original from which a copy is derived.
Okay, so there is a lineage there.
Yes, a direct lineage.
Yeah.
A physical or conceptual derivation. It represents the original object because it came from the original object.
And what about our word?
Homoiōma, on the other hand, simply denotes a likeness or correspondence. There is absolutely no necessity of an interconnection or a derivation between the two things being compared.
Okay, think about it this way. If you go to the fridge right now and pull out two identical eggs and you hold them up side by side, they are homoiōma.
Right.
They look alike, they correspond to one another, they have the same shape and color, but one egg did not spawn the other egg.
No, they just share a likeness.
Yeah, they just happen to share a likeness. But a wax seal on an ancient letter, that is an icon.
That is a great analogy.
Right. It derives its shape directly from the metal stamp that pressed down into it. There is an original metal stamp, and there is a derived wax copy. The wax seal only exists in that shape because the original dictated it.
That is a highly effective way to visualize the mechanics at play.
Yeah.
And we see the Apostle Paul leverage both of these words to make a devastating theological point in Romans chapter 1, verse 23.
What is happening in that verse?
He is describing the tragedy of human idolatry. He writes that humans changed the glory of the immortal God into the homoiōma, the likeness of an eikon, an image of a mortal man and birds and animals.
Wait, let's pause there because I have to push back on Paul's phrasing.
Okay, go ahead.
Why use both words? Why say the likeness of an image? It feels a bit redundant.
It does sound like that in English.
Grammatically, we call that a pleonasm, using more words than necessary to express an idea. Why wouldn't Paul just say they worshipped an image of a bird or they worshipped the likeness of a man? Stacking them on top of each other seems clunky.
It might seem redundant in English, but in the Greek, stacking those words shows the sheer emptiness of idols. Paul is demonstrating a total degradation of divine glory.
How so?
Well, think about the process of making an idol. An idol is an eikon because it is fashioned to look like a man or an animal. The woodcarver looks at a bird and derives the shape of his carving from observing the creature.
Right, he copies the bird.
Yes, it is a copy derived from an original. But then human beings take that derived image, that piece of carved wood, and they treat it as a homoiōma, a corresponding likeness of the immortal God.
Oh, I see. So it is a double reduction.
Yes. They take a piece of carved wood, which is just a copy of a bird, and they set it up as a corresponding reality of the creator of the universe.
That is wild.
They are worshiping an empty shape, fashioned to correspond to earthly bodies, completely missing the reality of the divine. Paul stacks the words to show how far humanity has fallen in their thinking.
They traded the infinite, immortal God for a likeness of a copy of a bird.
Precisely.
That means Paul is using surgical precision with his vocabulary. He's not just throwing synonyms around to sound poetic. He is making a concrete philosophical point about the absurdity of idolatry.
Right.
But, to truly grasp how Paul uses these words in the New Testament, we cannot just look at secular Greek geometry. We have to look backward at the Jewish scriptures.
Yes, the Old Testament background is huge here.
We have to see how the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, utilized these concepts. The scholars who translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek centuries before Christ had to make tough choices.
Very tough choices.
They had to figure out which Greek words best capture the original Hebrew thoughts.
And the Septuagint translation gives us a massive window into how Jewish thinkers understood these Greek terms.
What did they do with our word?
The translators used homoiōma and its cognates to represent several different Hebrew words. They used it for the Hebrew word demut, which means a model or a shape. They used it for tabnit, which is a pattern or a copy. And they used it for timuna, which refers to a form or a manifestation.
How does that look in practice? Where do we see that?
Consider the book of Ezekiel. When the prophet is describing his intense, almost psychedelic visions of the heavenly realms, he frequently says he saw the likeness of a man or the likeness of a hand.
Oh, right. He says that all the time.
The translators chose homoiōma for those moments. Ezekiel is struggling to articulate heavenly realities using earthly comparisons.
Because it's beyond human language.
Right. He does not want to say he saw a literal human hand attached to a literal human body up in the celestial throne room. He is saying, well, it corresponded to a hand. It shared a resemblance with a man, but it was not derived from a man. It is an analogy.
That makes logical sense for prophetic visions. You need a word that says, it looked like this, but it wasn't this.
Yes.
But let's jump into the most famous use of these concepts in the entire Old Testament.
Yeah, the creation account.
Yes, the creation account, Genesis 1.26. Let us make man in our image and likeness. In the Greek translation, that is eikon for image and homoiotes for likeness.
And this specific phrasing brings up a massive historical and theological question.
Oh.
And it is a question that completely consumed the early church fathers, particularly during the Arian controversy in the 4th century.
The Arian controversy was huge.
To give some context, the Arian controversy was a massive theological battle over the very nature of Jesus Christ. Arius argued that Jesus was a created being, not co-eternal with God the Father.
Which the church rejected.
Yes, but this debate forced the church to define the very DNA of divinity and humanity. In that environment, the theologians in Alexandria became obsessed over Genesis 1.26 and the two specific words used for humanity's creation.
They saw image and likeness and decided those were two entirely different things.
Yes, they argued that there was a real ontological distinction between eikon and homoiotes.
We should define ontological.
Ontological meaning it relates to the actual structural reality of a being. It is not just a poetic difference, it is a difference in the fundamental fabric of what a human being is.
Walk us through their logic on that. How did they separate the two?
The Alexandrian theologians like Clement of Alexandria and later Gregory of Nyssa, who actually devoted an entire treatise to this specific question, taught that the eikon, the image, is something humanity was created in. It is a baseline reality, common to all human beings. Crucially, they argued this image remains intact even after the fall into sin.
Where do they get that from?
They point to Genesis 9.6 to back this up, where God forbids murder long after the fall because man was made in the image of God, so the image is retained.
Going back to our analogy, the wax seal is still there. Even if the wax is a little chipped or smudged, the stamp was made.
That is the idea.
Yeah.
But the homoiotes, the likeness, they argued, is something entirely different. They taught that the likeness is what humanity was created for. It is the goal.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it is a moral correspondence to God that we do not possess by default, but rather something we must strive to attain through our actions and spiritual discipline.
That sounds heavily influenced by outside philosophy. I mean, that doesn't sound purely biblical.
It is. You can see the heavy influence of Greek philosophy here, specifically Plato. Plato talked a great deal about likeness to God as far as possible being the ultimate goal of the human soul.
Wow, so they just brought that in.
The Alexandrian theologians lived in a culture saturated with Platonic thought. They absorbed this philosophical framework and applied it directly to the text of Genesis. They claimed Adam lost the likeness at the fall, but retained the image. Therefore, the Christian life is about regaining that lost likeness through moral effort.
Okay, I'm going to challenge that Alexandrian split pretty hard.
Let's hear it.
I want you to think about how standard Hebrew poetry functions. The Old Testament is filled with parallelism. A Hebrew writer will state a concept in one line and then restate the very same concept using slightly different words in the next line.
Right.
They do it for rhythm, for emphasis, for poetic beauty. Think of the Psalms. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. A lamp and a light are the same thing in that context.
Yes, they are.
Is it not highly probable that image and likeness in Genesis 1.26 are just standard Hebrew parallelism? Moses is saying the same thing twice to show the gravity of human creation. By forcing a massive philosophical distinction onto those two words, it feels like Clement and Gregory were importing Plato into Moses.
Many modern linguistic scholars share your critique. The linguistic data shows that homoiōma in the Septuagint is mostly used for the Hebrew word demut, simply in the sense of similarity.
Right.
There is no hard grammatical evidence in the ancient Hebrew to suggest a structural difference between the two terms. However, regardless of whether the Alexandrians were grammatically correct about Genesis, their interpretation changed history.
It really did.
This linguistic split led directly to the medieval schoolmen's doctrine of a twofold imprint on humanity.
And that twofold imprint shaped centuries of theology regarding human capability after the fall.
Huge implications.
Because if you believe humanity only lost a supplemental likeness but kept a structurally sound image, you end up with a very different view of human will and original sin than if you believe the entire human nature was corrupted. It dictates how you view the need for divine grace.
It does. If the likeness is just a moral goal you strive for, and your baseline image is still functionally intact, then salvation becomes a cooperative effort.
Yeah, that's the issue.
It becomes a system of human striving aided by grace, rather than a complete resurrection of a spiritually dead being. It shifts the entire mechanism of how a person relates to God. Which brings us to the next massive question. If humanity lost its perfect correspondence to God in the fall, or, if that likeness was fundamentally corrupted at the root, how did God orchestrate the rescue?
That is the core of the gospel.
How do you fix a broken correspondence? We have to leave the Old Testament debates and see how the Apostle Paul uses homoiōma to describe the incarnation of Jesus Christ. This brings us to some of the most dense, glorious passages in the New Testament. Let's start with Philippians chapter 2, verse 7.
The kenosis passage.
Yes, this is known as the kenosis passage, speaking of Christ emptying himself. Paul writes that Christ took the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men in the Greek, and homoiōma anthropon genomenos.
So he became the homoioma of humanity. He corresponded to us.
Yes. Paul is showing that Christ underwent a true metamorphosis. He renounced the outward glory of his divine form and assumed the form of a slave. He truly became a man, not just in outward appearance, but in thought, in feeling, in physical limitation.
He really became human.
He who was the full image of God became the full corresponding likeness of man. This terminology is fiercely anti-docetic.
We should define docetic for the listener. Docetism was an early heresy that claimed Jesus only seemed or appeared to be human.
Right.
The word comes from a Greek root meaning to seem. They believed flesh was inherently bad, so God would never actually touch it. They argued Jesus was a divine spirit wearing a human costume.
Like a disguise.
An outward fake disguise, like a hologram that looked like a man but had no physical substance.
And that idea destroys the entire mechanism of salvation. If Jesus did not have real human blood, he could not shed it. If he did not have a real human nervous system, he could not suffer. When Paul uses homoiōma here, he means Christ took on a nature that made him genuinely like men. The divine figure entered the physical history of the world. However, there is a boundary line drawn by the word.
What kind of boundary line?
The earthly form, the true humanity, he assumed, acted as a husk enclosing his unchanging essential existence. Christ remained God at the core of his being. He achieved perfect obedience, which no other human could manage, proving that even as a man, he was in the depths of his essence a being of another kind.
So Paul uses the word to say he is truly like us, but not derived from us in the sense of being a simple mortal, that is, Philippians.
Right.
But Paul takes this concept and walks an incredibly tense theological tightrope in Romans chapter 8, verse 3. He introduces the most complex linguistic balancing act we're going to look at today.
It is a brilliant piece of writing.
Paul writes that God sent his son in the likeness of sinful flesh and homoiōmati sarkos hamartias.
This verse is the absolute crux of New Testament Christology. Everything hinges on these few Greek words.
I want you to notice what Paul does not say here, because the omissions are just as loud as the words he chooses. He does not say, God sent his son in sinful flesh.
That would be a massive problem.
If Paul had written that, it would mean Jesus had a sin nature. It would mean the Savior himself was corrupted by the fall and needed saving.
Right.
He also does not say God sent his son in the likeness of flesh. If he had written that, it would mean Jesus was not fully human. It would be that docetic hologram disguise we just talked about.
So he threads the needle.
He threads the needle. Jesus had real human flesh, but he only had the likeness of the sin-infected flesh that we have.
The Greek grammar of homoiōma here indicates two realities simultaneously. First, it indicates the likeness in appearance. In outward form, Jesus was in no way different from other men. His physical body was capable of experiencing everything human bodies experience.
Like exhaustion and hunger.
Yes. He felt physical exhaustion, he felt hunger, he felt the pain of the whip. But second, the word indicates a distinction in essence. The homoiōma keeps us from a deduction Paul absolutely did not want us to make.
Which is?
That Christ became subject to the internal power of sin.
Not everyone agrees that Paul successfully walked that tightrope, though. There is a critique from a scholar named J. Weiss that we need to address, because it attacks the very logic of Paul's phrasing.
J. Weiss offers a massive critique of Romans 8.3. He argues that Paul was stuck in an antinomy, a logical contradiction that cannot be resolved.
Okay, what is his argument?
Weiss claims that Paul's theology in Romans 8 requires that sin be judged in the flesh during the crucifixion. God condemns sin in the flesh. Therefore, Weiss argues, Paul logically needed Christ's flesh to actually contain sin so that the sin could be physically put to death on the cross.
Because you cannot kill something that isn't there.
Right. But Weiss says, Paul could not stomach the idea of a sinful Jesus. It offended his reverence for Christ. So according to Weiss, Paul chose this vague middle ground, the likeness of sinful flesh, leaving the thought of the incarnation in a state of vacillation.
He thinks Paul is wavering.
Yes. Weiss says Paul is hovering between true humanity and a purely external acceptance of a human body. Weiss basically accuses Paul of backing into docetism because he couldn't solve the theological math problem.
I am going to vigorously disagree with Weiss's rationalistic critique here.
I thought you might.
Weiss is acting like Paul stumbled into a contradiction because he wasn't smart enough to see the trap. But Paul is not confused. He is precise.
How so?
Let me offer an analogy to help visualize what Paul is doing with homoioma here and why Weiss is missing the mark.
Go for it.
Think of a doctor walking into a highly infectious quarantine ward in a hospital. The doctor is wearing a state-of-the-art biohazard suit. To the deadly virus floating around in the room, the doctor appears in the likeness of a vulnerable human body.
Oh, that's good.
The virus sees arms, legs, a torso. It sees a host. The doctor is truly in the room. He is fully present in the infected environment. He can touch the patients. He breathes the air in the ward through his filtration system. He experiences the physical exhaustion of the work. He is really there.
But he's protected.
But the doctor is structurally immune to the infection because of what he is wearing. He shares the likeness of the vulnerable patients. He is a human in the ward, but he does not share their infection.
That is very clear.
Christ assumes our nature to condemn sin, but he assumes it without the internal infection of original sin. He enters the quarantine ward of human history. The virus of sin attacks him in the wilderness. It attacks him in Gethsemane. It attacks him on the cross, treating him like a normal host. But the infection cannot penetrate his nature. He is the doctor in the ward. Weiss assumes you have to be infected to defeat the virus, but Paul is arguing that only the uninfected doctor can administer the cure.
That analogy captures the mechanics of the incarnation perfectly, and the wider New Testament corroborates your defense of Paul against Weiss. Look at the book of Hebrews.
What does Hebrews say?
The author of Hebrews, in chapter 4, verse 15, writes that Christ was tempted in all things, like as we are using the cognate kath homoiōma, yet without sin.
So the temptation is real, but the internal capitulation is absent.
The linguistic phrasing highlights the similarity of his temptation to ours. The temptation was real, the environment was real, the psychological pressure was real, but the distinction remained. Even in the face of temptation that embraced his whole life, he was without sin. Sin, which clung to the physical world he entered, had no internal sway over him.
So Christ takes on the likeness to act as our representative. He stands in our place as the uninfected doctor.
Yes.
And understanding Christ as the sinless representative naturally invites a comparison to the man who brought the infection into the ward in the first place, Adam. If we have the second man who brings the cure, we need to understand the first man who brought the disease.
This is a vital connection to make. In Romans chapter 5, Paul explicitly contrasts Adam and Christ. He sets them up as federal heads of humanity.
Let's define federal head for the listener. Think of a federal head like a political ambassador or a representative. If the president of a country signs a treaty, the entire country is bound by that treaty, even if the individual citizens didn't hold the pen.
Right, because the president speaks for them.
The president acts as the federal head. Paul is arguing that Adam acted as the representative for all humanity in the garden, and Christ acts as the representative for all believers on the cross.
That is the structural logic Paul uses. And he uses our word, homoiōma, to clarify a complex point about the nature of sin in human history under Adam's federal headship. In Romans 5:1, Paul argues about the specific time period between Adam and Moses.
Okay, what is unique about that time period?
He notes that death held sway even over those whose sins were not in the homoiōma, the likeness or copy of Adam's transgression.
Let's break down the logic of that verse, because Paul is building a very specific legal argument. Paul is saying people died between Adam and Moses. Since death is the penalty for sin, the fact that they died proves they were sinners.
Right.
But Paul adds this qualifier. Their sin was not a homoioma of Adam's sin. What made Adam's sin so unique that no one else could copy it?
To understand that, you have to look at the nature of the law given in the Garden of Eden. Adam broke an explicit, direct command from God. God spoke directly to Adam and gave a positive law. Do not eat of this specific tree.
It was incredibly direct.
Adam's transgression was a direct, face-to-face violation of a spoken divine statute. Now look at the people who lived after Adam was exiled, but before Moses was born. Moses is the one who received the law on Mount Sinai. So the people living in that interim period between Adam and Moses did not have the explicit written Mosaic law.
Ah, I see.
They did not have a specific codified legal command from God to break in the same way Adam did.
They could not copy his specific type of legal transgression because they didn't have the same rule book. God never walked up to them and said, "Do not touch this specific bush."
That is the point. The linguistic data notes that homoiōma here means copy. Their daily sin was not a direct copy of Adam's specific legal rebellion.
But they still died.
Yes, yet they still sinned against the moral law written on their hearts, and consequently they still died. Death reigned over them. They fell victim to the consequence of Adam's initial breach of the treaty, even though their personal sins were not exact replicas of his Edenic rebellion.
It shows the absolute devastation of Adam's choice as our federal head. He broke the original correspondence, the original likeness, and the fallout was universal death. The infection spread to everyone in the ward.
It did.
But even in this fallen state, even with the infection raging, the biblical writers insist that humanity retains a fundamental dignity. The linguistic study points us to the book of James to highlight this reality.
James 3.9 is a sobering verse.
In James chapter 3, verse 9, James points out the sheer hypocrisy of human speech. He says we use our tongues to bless our Lord and Father, and then we turn around and use that very same tongue to curse people who are made in the homoiōma, the likeness of God.
It is a sobering application of the theological concept. James is pointing out a terrifying inconsistency in the human heart. He who curses a man turns against God himself, who created man after his own similitude.
That applies right now, today.
Completely. Even after the fall, even under the reign of death, Paul talks about in Romans 5, the human being standing in front of you, the person who cut you off in traffic, the coworker who frustrates you, corresponds to the Creator. Turning against humanity with your words is an act of turning against the Creator's likeness.
So we have this massive theological landscape laid out before us. We have Adam, the first federal head who brought death and corrupted the likeness. And we have Christ, the second federal head, the sinless likeness who brings life and immunity to the virus of sin.
The contrast is total.
The ultimate question for you, the listener, and for every Christian throughout history is, how does a person cross over? How do you get out of the lineage of Adam and into the lineage of Christ? How do you participate in that sinless likeness?
The Apostle Paul answers this question directly, and in doing so, he triggers one of the fiercest, most complex debates in Christian history. He answers it with the concept of baptism.
Ah, the baptismal battleground. We are heading to Romans chapter 6, verse 5. This verse is the epicenter of the entire debate over what baptism actually does.
Yes, it is.
Paul writes, "If we have been united with him in the likeness of his death, we will certainly also be united with him in the resurrection." In the Greek, the phrase united with him in the likeness of his death centers on the words tu homoiōmati tu senatuatu.
Before we even get to the massive theological implications, there is an initial grammatical syntactical problem that scholars have to solve in this sentence.
Grammar always complicates things.
It does. How do we translate the combination of these words? Does the Greek mean we grow with the copy or imitation of his death? Or does it mean we grow together with him by imitation of his death?
Those sound fairly similar on the surface, but the implications for how a human relates to God are vastly different.
They are entirely different mechanisms. The second option assumes we have to mentally insert the phrase with him, autuk in Greek, into the text. It implies our imitation is the vehicle.
Okay, what does the text actually support?
The linguistic data heavily prefers the first option. There's no with him in the original Greek text. The direct wording implies we are united with, or grow together with, the homoiōma, the likeness of his death itself. The likeness is the thing we are joined to.
Okay, so we are united to the likeness of his death. What is that likeness? This is where the debate explodes.
Big time.
We are going to walk through 4 competing theological views, and these views represent the major traditions of the Christian church. We need to look at the logical mechanics of each one. Let's start with the first view.
The first view is the symbolic, or representative view. Scholars like Barth and Wickenhauser champion this interpretation. They argue that homoiōma in this verse refers to the actual physical act of water baptism itself.
The ritual itself.
Right, going down into the water and coming back up out of the water. For them, the physical ritual of baptism is a reproduction, a visual similitude of Christ's historical death and resurrection. The water is the likeness.
So in this view, baptism is a picture. It represents the reality the same way a photograph represents a person.
That is a good way to describe it.
You look at a photograph of your mother and you say, that is my mother, but you don't literally believe the photo paper is her physical body. It is a symbol pointing to a historical reality. That is a very common view in many modern evangelical churches. The ritual is an outward symbol of an inward reality. Let's move to the second view.
The second view shifts the focus entirely away from the physical water and moves it to the believer's experience. Scholars like Schlatter and Zahn argue that the likeness is our internal death in baptism.
Our internal death.
Yes. It is the spiritual death to sin that we experience when we believe. This subjective internal experience of dying to our old self is a reflection or a type of Christ's historical objective death on the cross. We experience a corresponding internal death.
So the first view says the physical ritual is the likeness. The second view says our internal psychological and spiritual experience of conversion is the likeness. Then we hit the third view, which turns the dial all the way up on sacramental realism.
Yes, it really does. The third view is the Roman Catholic mystical view. Scholars like Stricker and Cassell are highlighted here. They argue for a profoundly sacramental, mystical presence in the water.
What does that mean practically?
They claim that the candidate in the water physically experiences the actual historical death of Christ made present. Stricker argues that the person baptized dies the death of Christ mystically. Cassell goes even further, arguing that the historical death and burial of Christ are necessarily immediately present in the sacrament.
Explain the mechanics of that, because that is a massive philosophical leap from the first two views.
In the mystical view, the sacrament collapses time. The historical event of the cross, which happened 2,000 years ago, is pulled forward into the present moment, or the believer is pulled backward into the past.
Wow.
The physical water becomes the literal historical death of Christ. When you go into the water, you literally die Christ's literal death. The distinction between the symbol and the historical event is erased.
That is a heavy concept. It claims the water is almost a mystical time machine, collapsing the distance between the first century and today, dropping the believer directly onto the cross at Golgotha.
That is the claim.
But then we have a fourth view, a Protestant view, primarily articulated by a scholar named Schleyer, which tries to find a theological middle ground between an empty symbol and a mystical time machine.
Schleyer proposes a sacramental but non-mystical view. He argues that we are organically linked to the saving reality of Christ's death, and that this saving reality is genuinely sacramentally present in baptism.
Okay, but how is that different from the third view?
This is the crucial function of our word for the day. The word homoiōma deliberately prevents us from saying we mystically travel back in time to the historical cross. The text says the sacramentally present death of Christ is the homoiōma of his historical death.
Let's follow that thread.
It is like the historical death. It communicates the actual spiritual benefits of the historical death, but it is not the identical historical event repeated. The historical cross happened once in space and time. Baptism connects you to the power of that cross without repeating the crucifixion.
I want to synthesize this because this is dense theology, but it changes how a person views their own faith on a Sunday morning. This fourth view, Schleyer's view, honors the absolute reality of the sacrament without turning it into magic.
Yes, that is a fair assessment.
Paul is using homoioma as a guardrail on a dangerous mountain road. On the left side of the road, the guardrail stops us from reducing baptism to a simple empty symbol, a picture that carries no actual spiritual weight.
Right.
But on the right side of the road, the guardrail stops us from claiming the water is a mystical time machine that physically repeats the crucifixion. The saving reality of the cross is genuinely, objectively present to the believer in the sacrament, but it remains a likeness. It respects the once-for-all nature of what Jesus did on Calvary. He died once. We are united to the likeness of that death.
The word homoiōma rules out any idea of a mystical relation to the historical saving acts, while maintaining a firm grip on the present spiritual reality of those acts. The connection is real, but the historical event remains distinct.
That is a beautiful balance.
And Paul does not leave us hanging in the tomb. He concludes Romans 6.5 with a massive guarantee based on this union.
The resurrection guarantee. We will certainly also be united with him in the resurrection.
Since we are united in the likeness of his death, the logic demands a future resurrection. If we go down into the likeness of the tomb, we must come up into the likeness of the new life. However, Paul points out something stunning about the timeline here.
What is that?
He says later in the chapter that believers are already alive to God. Because of this resurrection likeness is not just a promise for the end of the world. It is not just waiting for you after you die. It is already laying its impress on your daily life. The future resurrection is casting its light backward into the believer's present day.
We are living in the dawn of that future reality. We have passed through the likeness of death, and now the likeness of his resurrected life is the operating system for how we interact with the world today.
Exactly.
It dictates how we forgive people who hurt us, how we handle our money, how we love our families. We have been united to the likeness of a new kind of human life.
And this brings the entire linguistic study to a tense, beautiful conclusion. We live this overlapping of ages. We have the likeness of resurrection life now, but we are still waiting for the physical resurrection of our bodies.
The tension of the already and the not yet.
Yes. The biblical writers point us to the Apostle John to close out the concept. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, John writes about this tension. The Christian life right now is lived in expectation. We are alive to God, but we are waiting for the final fulfillment. John writes, we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, using the root word homoios, for we shall see him as he is.
That is pointing to the parousia.
Yes, the parousia is the theological term for the physical return of Christ at the end of history.
That is the ultimate horizon. At the parousia, the process is complete. The likeness is fully realized. We won't just have the down payment of the likeness. We will have the full reality.
The transfiguration of Christians will enable them to see the transfigured Christ as he is. The correspondence will be absolute. The gap between what we are supposed to be and what we currently are will vanish completely.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a closing reflection built on the mechanics we have unpacked today. We started by talking about the Alexandrian theologians, those early church fathers like Clement and Gregory, who argue that we are born with the image of God, but we spend our entire lives growing into the likeness of God.
Right.
We debated their Hebrew grammar, but their practical application of the concept is staggering. If that concept holds true in your daily life, then every single day is an opportunity to close that gap. Look at your daily habits. Look at your responses to stress at work. Look at your interactions with the people who frustrate you the most.
It hits it close to home.
Are you settling for just bearing the image, the baseline, unerasable stamp of humanity that even a murderer possesses? Or are you actively stepping into the profound homoioma, the exact moral likeness of the sinless Christ you were redeemed to imitate?
That is the real question.
We started this conversation by talking about X-rays and medical diagnoses. The beauty of the gospel is that while the virus of sin makes the X-ray of our soul look murky and broken, the likeness of Christ is the cure. Living into that homoioma brings that crisp, clean image back into focus. We don't have to guess what a fully functioning human being is supposed to look like. We don't have to invent a moral code from scratch. We just have to look at the uninfected doctor who walked into the ward and imitate his likeness.